Free at last. Civil rights movement and the people who made it. Fred Powledge. Reading from the preface. The civil rights movement did not start on May 17, 1954, when the United States Supreme Court struck down racially segregated education. The movement did not begin on December 1st, 1955, when Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to leave a white seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, or 4 days later, when Montgomery blacks began a successful bus boycott. Nor did it start, though many would argue otherwise, on February 1st, 1960, when 4 Negro college students sat down at a whites-only dime store lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. The civil rights movement was not something spontaneous, but the inevitable outcome of centuries of mistreatment of black people by white people and their governments. The civil rights movement did not grow out of a dream of any one man or woman, or even a small group of people, or formal organization, and it was not guided by any number of sage strategists from the North. The people who made up the movement were almost as diverse as America itself. Their numbers included lifelong believers in the American system. There were leftists who had cut their eye teeth on radicalism as preached from the soapboxes of New York's Union Square. There were South Carolina undertakers who would have voted Republican if they had been allowed to vote. There were teenagers who were tired, even before they started, of waiting for segregation to end itself, and who, like all young people, rejected the patience of their elders. There were very old people, and there were very young people, and there were all ages in between. There were members of the black establishment, the black ministers who served black people in churches that were as strictly segregated as schools and lunch counters. There were executives of the only old-line black organizations, the American Association for the Advancement of Colored People and the National Urban League, that had been fighting segregation for as long as anyone could remember. There were people whose scorn for that black establishment was nearly as great as their dislike for the white-run system. There were blacks who lived in the urban centers of Atlanta and Birmingham, in both stylish brick homes and neglected public housing. There were people who lived in the deepest isolation in parts of rural Mississippi and Alabama, where the plantation era had never ended. The people who made the movement were far from being all the black people in America, and far from being all the black people in the South. An enumeration would have been impossible, and surely the work of the movement was carried out by only a tiny percentage of all those who could have taken part. And yet this small group was able to generate a wave that washed over the entire nation, that spawned similar movements in a dozen fields. The civil rights movement in America was not the effort of a single race of people. It was not the movement by and for black people, and it was a campaign that was directed against a system that had been thought up, maintained, and enforced by white people. But many white people helped the movement. Some gave their lives for it. So it is impossible to talk about civil rights movement without talking too about its white participants. And of course, it was white people of another sort who made the civil rights movement necessary. In America now, in the 90s, the civil rights movement is not the same movement that commanded so much attention in the 60s. It is not to say that the earlier movement ended. Membership has changed and the rhetoric has been altered. Some of its original goals have been met. Many other goals remain elusive, and efforts to cope with some of the early problems of racism have uncovered other just as serious, if not more so. The Southwide campaign that some of its first proponents thought would last most few years now promises to go on indefinitely and nationally, even internationally. This is because Americans and the world's resistance to the elimination of discrimination seems to be without end, because many of the nation's opinion leaders and policymakers seem preoccupied with other matters, indulging in the illusion that in the field of race relations, there is no more to be done. Americans must understand what happened in the days of the movement, but without comprehension of what occurred in the past, we cannot hope to finish the job of subduing racial discrimination. And until we do that, we will continue to waste the minds and talents of a large portion of the population. And our understanding of the movement is in serious jeopardy. The efforts of decades ago, the marches, mass meetings, and murders, the triumphs and setbacks and speeches, all seemed at the time so clear and precise and memorable. they could never fade from understanding or suffer the terrible fate of misinterpretation. But we have started now to forget how it happened. It has been 37 years since the Brown decision, 36 since the Montgomery bus boycott, 31 since Greensboro sit-in. A generation has grown up knowing of the movement's active days only at secondhand. That generation, furthermore, has no experience with America, where politicians are at least circumspect about their corruption, where political assassination is a remarkable event, where television gathers its dues by a 16-millimeter film camera set on heavy wooden tripods. This generation has trouble believing some of the things that happened in the 50s and 60s. There are teenagers who will argue that colored and white signs over drinking fountains are only an aberration. That they only existed in a handful of the worst Deep South communities. It is unbelievable, they say, that black people could have let such an indignity happen on a region-wide scale. Maybe they are right, and it is unbelievable, but it happened. America has developed a compulsion about condensing events, even the most complicated issues, to tiny chunks of news that fit into one sentence on the television screen or one paragraph in the newspaper. Serious information has little chance these days in the mass media. An in-depth examination of the social problem is likely as not means a television docudrama that distorts some truth and ignores others, twists the fundamental character of actual people, abuses time and geography to fit into the script, and substitutes production values for honesty. Because Americans now get more of their information from what they see on screen than what they read on paper, and because what reaches the screen has such profound influence on what people think, historical truth is in deep trouble. And so, my precious documents that were carelessly engraved onto cheap paper, the truth of what happened in those days is fading and is in danger of being lost. Pseudo-truths replace it. In the minds of untold numbers of Americans, for example, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was the civil rights movement. Thought it up, led it, produced its victories, became its sole martyr. School children, including black school children, are taught this. America has a near pathological need to codify everything of importance in terms of personalities, even better in terms of single personality. And King's charisma and sincerity makes him the prime candidate for the people who was the movement. It's much easier and quicker to say, as countless teachers, politicians, and miscellaneous other public figures do when encountered on television during the annual celebration of Black History Month, that Martin Luther King led the civil rights movement and freed the black people. That it is explained what really happened. That it is to explain what really happened, which is that Martin Luther King and an awful lot of other people, many of them far less charismatic than he, created a movement and freed themselves. America has a near pathological need to codify everything of importance in terms of personalities, even better in terms of single personalities. And King's charisma and sincerity make him the prime candidate for persons who make the movement, who was the movement. America has a near pathological need to codify everything of importance in terms of personalities, even better in terms of single personalities. And King's charisma and sincerity make him the prime candidate for the person who was the movement. It is much easier and quicker to say, as countless teachers, politicians, miscellaneous other public figures do when encountered on television during the annual celebration of Black History Month, that Martin Luther King led the civil rights movement and freed the black people. And than it is to explain what really happened, which is that Martin Luther King and an awful lot of other people, many of them far less charismatic than he, created a movement and freed themselves. Jesse Jackson is widely perceived as the hero of the movement, a perception he rarely denied, although he spent most of the movement years in Chicago. Jackson's major claim to movement fame rises from the fact that he was with Martin Luther King in April 1968 when the leader was assassinated in Memphis, and that some of King's blood stained Jackson's shirt, which Jackson wore back to Chicago. Jackson did little work in the Southern movement and was on a handful for few of its significant events. when he was built on what he has built on the foundation created by the movement, a popular political effort that seems truly interracial, is impressive. But to refer to Jesse Jackson as a civil rights leader for the movement, the 60s, is simply wrong. It does not and does great injustice to the leaders and followers who were there. The degree to which Americans have been kept in ignorance about any but a handful of the movement's chief personalities is illustrated by a story, almost certainly apocryphal, since it has been reported by several sources. Always is something that happened to a friend of a friend, about a teacher who, during Black History Month, signed reading on various figures, including the black nationalist Malcolm X. One young student returned from his research and asked for more. He he had become interested, he said, in the things that were said back then by Malcolm X. The teacher didn't know whether to be depressed that his student hadn't known enough about Malcolm X to get his name right, or overjoyed that the child understood Roman numerals. History is in danger of being bent out of shape too. In the current days, recollections of those whites who were in the positions of power in the South in the 50s and 60s, who rose to rattle at every opportunity in favor of white supremacy, and who now proclaim that they didn't really mean it, that they were saying what the white electorate, since there was hardly any other kind, wanted to hear, and that the only reason they did that was to keep the rednecks from getting violent. George Wallace has announced he was wrong and begged blacks for forgiveness. Herman Talmadge recalls what great fondness his black childhood playmates. Storm Thurmond takes to the Senate floor in an appeal for fairness for the black political nominee. It may be true, and in many cases, it may be obvious back then, that the great majority of the SEGs, as they are now known in the South, reporters and civil rights activists, did not have their whole hearts in their racism. But that should not obscure the fact that at the time, some of them were inciting violence and all were inciting hatred against black people. They were actively pursuing policies that denied Negroes their constitutional and human rights. They spread the message throughout their jurisdictions. To those, some violent, prone whites, they now say they were trying to calm down, that violence against black people were no big deal, nor was defiance of federal authority. Their actions and inactions are responsible for countless incidents of violence, years of indignity. No one knows how many murders and premature deaths.